So welcome to the Women's Room Legal Division podcast. Today, I'm really delighted to be joined by Fiona Rutherford, who is Chief Executive of the amazing organisation Justice, which works tirelessly to build a fairer UK justice system, which is within everyone's reach. So I'm so pleased that Fiona has agreed to come onto the podcast today, because I think that potentially not enough of our legal community is really aware of the great work that Justice does. Certainly when I was a lawyer working in the city in finance, I didn't really know about Justice. And it was only when I ended up going onto the board of the government legal department that, to be honest, I learned a lot more about administrative law and the rule of law itself. And that's when I started to hear about Justice. And I'm proud to say that I am a member of the Justice 60, which is a group of supporters of justice that get together on a regular basis. And at the end of the podcast, we'll talk about the different ways you can get involved in supporting justice. I think a lot of the bar are aware of Justice's existence, but it would be really great to get some more information out there, particularly into the world of private practice, about the really important work that Justice does. But I'm also really pleased that Fiona is here on the podcast because of who she is and because she's had such an interesting career working for many different organizations that I think people would be interested in hearing more about and potentially think about working for at some point. So Fiona, thank you so much for coming on today. I was wondering, can I take you back to the beginning of your career and like, how did you make the decision to go into law? What was it that drove you in that direction?
So there was nothing I wanted to be a doctor, but I'd actually not had great career advice, and so hadn't done the right GCSEs, which meant I couldn't do the right A-levels. So I knew by about 16 that was going to be a harder course, or I'd have to re-course to achieve that. And I thought about, in the loosest sense, as one does at 15 or 16. I think people are a lot more au fait about it nowadays, about what things I was good at, what I enjoyed. And I did enjoy debating. And I have this streak of fairness that has been with me since I can remember. And putting those two things together, the criminal bar seemed like a good alternative to medicine. So by around 16 or so, and without having any sort of family members in the profession, I started that journey of trying to become a lawyer. So yeah, and from there I went on to study law and French actually at university. And then
any regrets now about not becoming a doctor? Do you still have a bit of a hankering when you go to a hospital to think, oh, that could be me here?
I mean, not when I read lots in the press about what the health system is having to go through, although the justice has equally difficult issues. Yeah, I mean, occasionally I have those moments, but not anywhere close enough to leave a system and a sector that I have a huge amount of commitment and affection for.
Yeah, it's interesting, I think, because a lot of lawyers are interested in being doctors, and a lot of doctors want to be lawyers. And then the other thing is some form of writing, journalism, writing. Those three things seems like they all attract the same people. So it's also really interesting what you say about the criminal bar, because although I've worked in law, for most of my career, when my daughter was thinking about going into law and she was like, oh, should I look at the bar? I had no clue where to start. It seems like it's a bit more opaque than nowadays going into private practice. So how did you find out about it, and how did you manage to, so you did your degree in law and French, and then how did you get into getting a position at the bar?
So I made sure that when I was at university, I took advantage of going to a range of different sessions that were set up, and it was through that I learned more about what the bar course was versus what was then the LPC, the law solicitors course. And I spoke to a range of those speakers that used to come to the university. I helped out we had a sort of a loose version of a clinic that helped students with rental issues and tenancy issues, etc. So joined that, and again had access to some of the lawyers who supervised, and again just asked what were probably really stupid questions, but to me were not, and were valuable in terms of helping me map how I get from A to B, which for me was from where I was at university to being in a courtroom with a wig and gown on.
Yeah. And so what was the process? How did you end up in the courtroom?
So I went to bar school straight after I finished my degree, which is a very expensive, even more expensive process now, although there is more range of where you can go. I think there are only three bar schools when I started. I went through that process and obviously got my qualifications at the end of that. And then you have to go into pupillage, as your listeners will know. And in criminal law, it is unheard of to get a tenancy, which is the next step, which is where you get you have some long-termism to your role. So no one gets that within 12 months. In other commercial sets, you can get that in 12 months' time. So I had to do 18 months of pupillage, but you're on your feet after 6 months of watching somebody else. So at 6 months plus 1 day, I found myself in a magistrate's court X, representing somebody for their sentencing hearing, who basically shouted across the court, "I know more about this than you do, love," which was probably entirely right. Record. And so the learning curve, which we might talk about later, started very much from there. It is a very sharp learning curve as a pupil barrister.
Yeah, and very stressful, scary, wasn't it?
3 days later, I was sent a 3-day trial at the magistrate's court. So, it's one thing to do a clear mitigation, which you do lots of at bar school. It's quite another to take on a trial, particularly when they were faxing through, as one did in those days, the court papers, which took hours because the papers were actually massive. So learning how to think on your feet took on a whole other meaning.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you apply for pupillage with the chambers, and then do you get paid during that? It's like your training process. Do you get paid?
You do now. At the time, in the first 6 when I started, there was no mandatory payment. So now, thankfully, there is mandatory payment for all pupils from day one.
Okay.
But it's still really low in the sort of legal aid areas of law, because the chambers obviously have less turnover than the other sets, who can offer much bigger salaries.
Okay, and then you apply for tenancy, and then how do you get your work after you've got your tenancy? How does it operate in terms of you actually getting work?
You are your own business, so you actually have to business develop yourself, which no one really. I mean, maybe there is better education on this and training on this than there was in my day, but you watch and learn from other barristers. You do your best to be most professional with your instructing solicitors. You try to build confidence that you are somebody that can be trusted and relied upon and knows what they're talking about. So you literally are selling yourself on a daily basis. And so if you're not already a sort of a professional, or you don't have those sorts of organizational skills and so on, you quickly have to learn them if you are going to be successful.
Yeah. Okay. And then do you have any favorite war stories from your time at the criminal bar?
I mean, there's lots of different cases. I mean, the story I will always reflect on, not least. I mean, you and I were both at an event with the Lord Chancellor, the former Lord Chancellor Alex Chalk, last week, and the case actually that I mentioned that event was a Court of Appeal case to do with a woman who was a refugee from Rwanda, and how she had come across with nothing, heavily pregnant, and because she didn't have the right paperwork according to the law, she was put through a criminal process. And we were both in the case when it reached the Court of Appeal, because she was convicted in the most unfair and inhumane way by a Crown Court, with a judge that didn't allow her. Well, she was forced to breastfeed her baby at different interims throughout the trial. The baby was handed over to be looked after while she was having to sit in court during the trial by the very people that were prosecuting her, so by the border force people, because there was nobody else at court to do it. My sister and I, every morning and every evening, would have to go and pick up her black plastic bags with her only belongings in from the hostel that she was living in with her. I mean, it was just on every level the sorts of thing that you just wouldn't want anybody to have to go through, let alone a system that describes itself as being sort of world leading and with a good reputation worldwide of being humane to a large extent. So that's a case I will often reflect back on and think, well, we have to make sure we're not making that, have to improve on that. We can't let that happen again.
Which I guess is one of the reasons it's great where you are now, that you're in an organization that can do that. So tell me then, so criminal bar, how long was that for? How long were you there for?
I was there for about 7 or 8 years. And then I moved across to the Crown Prosecution Service.
Okay. And what was that decision? How did you make that decision?
lack of role models at the bar.
Okay.
Female role models. And again, I think that's probably changed quite a lot. But choices felt like there were sort of, well, one, you could be a judge, or two, you could be a silk, if you're ambitious and you want to do well. And I was, I had a great practice. I was at the Bailey fairly frequently. I'd sort of built up a expertise of homicide and fraud cases. Those are the two areas I really enjoyed working in. But I didn't really favour either of those two options as I saw them at the time. And the CPS was a bit of an instinctive in that I knew that there was a transferable skill set that I had. So I went as an advocate. But I also had this instinctive idea that in a part of a big organisation, I'd have a greater sense of what might exist. And I didn't really know how to put my finger on it. But as it turned out, I moved relatively quickly into sort of leadership roles, which I obviously hadn't experienced.
Yeah, it is interesting about the lack of role models. So you think really like not being able to look up and see someone who looked like you, who wanted to live life like you, think you're like, well, hold on. Does that mean I can't do it? Is that what it felt like?
Yeah, it was more, I thought I did want a family. I didn't obviously have one then but I didn't see sort of mothers that worked and were able. I saw one end of the spectrum, which was people coming back from mat leave into the roving rooms with awful stories about struggling to rebuild their practices, about not being supported appropriately, through to other women who didn't see their kids at all because they're having to, it's a hard job. Lots of weekend and evening work. And I felt there was probably somewhere that would allow both those things to happen in an opposite way. So, and again, I can't lie, the CPS is an organisation, as is a lot of the public sector jobs, where you get 6 months paid maternity. So those sorts of things were in my mind, as well as the sort of the job opportunities as well.
Yeah. And I mean, I think like with everywhere, things have got better for women now, both in private practice and at the bar. So we will, I will at some point talk to a barrister who's gone the whole way through, and we'll see what they think of it now. But yeah, tell us a bit about the CPS, what it is, what did you do there, what's it like? Yeah.
So it's a independent organisation that sits between the police and the courts to provide independent and objective advice on cases that come to it as to whether or not they should be prosecuted. And then they represent effectively the people in terms of those prosecutions. So they're not there for the victim, they're not there for the defendant, they are there as an entity to ensure that justice is done appropriately, that there is a prosecution body that can do that. And I mean, in terms of my time there, I joined, as I said, as an advocate out of London. So all of my practicing before that had been in London, although you get sent everywhere as a barrister, which is sometimes a blessing, sometimes a curse. But I was based in what was it was Hampshire and then became Wessex. So it included Dorset and Wiltshire as well. So that was having something that worked on a national wide, England and Wales wide basis was quite different. It obviously has a range of stakeholders that it has to work with to be successful. It's got to work with courts, it's got to work with judges, it's got to work with defence practitioners, it's got to work with a host of probation, a whole host of people. And there were a number of changes whilst I was there. I worked under Ken MacDonald for a bit. I worked under the current Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, whilst he was DPP. And then most recently, when I left, Alison Saunders was the DPP, who is now actually another member of Justice, which is nice.
And you were telling me earlier that Justice actually set up, or it was Justice came up with the idea of having an independent service in between the police and the courts, which is amazing.
Yeah, so we've proposed and then supported into being is how we describe it. The organisations that we all know well now. I mean, the CPS is one. The Ombudsman Service is another. That was something my predecessors in the 60s could see was a real issue, and it was from there that the Ombudsman came into being. And
that's where you can go and complain about the way you've been treated in the criminal justice system, is it? That's the process.
There are ombudsmen for all sorts of things. And I've got to say, I now have personal experience of using them in, well, the energy sector and in the financial services sector. But there is an ombudsman for quite a...
So Justice came up with the idea of the concept. Okay. Wow.
Into the parliamentary health, what's now the Parliamentary and Health Service Ombudsman. So that's where you have a particular issue with the way in which Parliament or the Health Service works. You can go to this ombudsman. You have to go through the internal complaints process, which is the same, I think, for pretty much all of them. Some are publicly funded, some are funded, as the sector will fund, but they are they are generally, I speak generally, a really great way to seek redress, to seek justice, as opposed to going to court or in advance of going to court.
Yeah, amazing. Okay. And then if you're in the CPS, because just thinking about anyone who might be thinking about it as a place to, to join, do you go to court? Do you end up going to court?
Depends on the role you have. If you're a lawyer there, and they have a growing, I think, community of legal execs who are then trained to become lawyers. I mean, I do think there's some really good opportunities there for those people who are struggling to get pupillage in the sort of independent or the private part of the independent bar is what it's described as often. I do think there's a good opportunity there because you, in both that role and even in the senior prosecutor's role or Crown prosecutor role and in the advocacy role that I had, there are definite opportunities to go to court. As an advocate, you're there every day. As the other, you might be there less so. But if you really want to see justice being done and being part of it, it does, it does tick a lot of boxes.
Yeah. Okay. Excellent. So, and then after CPS, what happened next?
So I ended my role in the CPS taking on a national role and sort of getting more involved in the strategy and in the sort of the policy areas of the organisation. So I was very fortunate to be sponsored effectively for a secondment with the court service, HMCTS, Her Majesty's Court Service as it were, and Tribunal Service as it was then, by two very senior members of the CPS, largely because I'd gone for interviews to join the senior civil service and failed twice, or came second twice, I should say, perhaps more positively, at taking the roles on. But clearly, what I'd have a real benefit from it for those other people that might be going through interviews and perhaps having the same level of success as I was having is that I got seen by senior people on the panel. And whilst I wasn't successful for those roles, I obviously did something okay or right in those interviews because they proactively, along with somebody who was then a mentor, put me forward for this secondment. And it was a one-off secondment into the court service to help with what was then their sort of £1 billion plus reform programme.
Right. So that's a great nugget of advice for people. Like, look, obviously it's always not nice when you go for something, you put a lot of effort and you get rejected, but like going for it gives you these other opportunities, not just to practice the process, but also potentially, as you say, to be seen. Did you have any strategy for dealing with rejection at that stage?
Probably not. I mean, I've always tried to learn. I mean, I would say it was probably not a conscious thing that I was doing at that time. I feel a lot wiser now. I probably will do in another 20 years. Mm-hmm. But I suppose having two interviews, for example, in succession, I really purpose reflected on the first interview, tried to then improve on that in the second interview. So, and I've taken that, now I do that. And after every interview, I will dictate into my phone straight after the interview all the questions that I can remember so that I can prepare better for those types of questions.
Great piece of advice.
Now as a matter of course.
Okay, fantastic. So then tell us a bit about your time in the civil service and with the court service and at the MOJ.
So I joined HMCTS in about 2015. As I said, I was part of the reform programme. And so my first job was to try to design what the future of the criminal system would look like. And secondly, to ensure that we got the money, the funding to do the entirety of the reform programme. So that's not just criminal justice, that includes the family system, it includes the wider civil system and the tribunals. And I knew, as I already hinted at, that I wanted to join the senior civil service. And so a big part of the first 6 months was working out what kind of roles there were and how to do that.
Just for people who won't understand, tell us what the senior civil service is.
So it's what I think old style used to be sort of what described as mandarins of government. So it's the It's the equivalent in an organisation of the senior leadership, I guess.
Like partners.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, okay.
And with that comes obviously greater responsibility, but greater access. And I suppose on the subject of access, one of the sort of biggest learning curve for me when I joined the HMCTS, the court service, was the access that you have or are required to have with ministers and with senior judges. So for those of you that don't know, the court service has a constitutional framework. And I think it's the only, as far as I know, it's the only body in the entirety of the public sector that has two masters that sit as two elements of the Constitution. So if the Constitution is the executive, the legislature, and the judiciary, this is, I think, the only body that has two constitutional masters in it. The Lord Chief Justice is part of the head of the service, and the Lord Chancellor is too. Actually, so is the senior president of Tribunals too. So it's
you've got a political master and a non-political master. Yeah. Okay. And so tell us about anything that strikes you about your time there and how different that role was.
So the access to ministers was fairly different. So politicians I'd always worked as a barrister. You're independent politically. You might be politically minded. I wasn't particularly, other than taking an interest in it. And the CPS, as I've said, is an independent body, and so is the court service, I hasten to add, is an independent executive agency. But you do have a political master. And so by week 3, I found myself in front of Michael Gove, who was the current Lord Chancellor, advising him on the criminal justice system and what options he had open to him in terms of what the future of that system ought to look like.
So pretty quickly.
It was, it happened, I mean, slightly terrifyingly, that I had the greatest knowledge of from a practical perspective of how the system worked. And Michael Gove was quite keen of understanding, my understanding is when he was in DFE, he would talk to, perhaps he ought to talk a bit more, depending on people's views, but he would talk to teachers, head teachers. And certainly I can say when he was with the MOJ, he did talk to practitioners and he did talk to judges a lot. So I think that having that practical experience held me in quite good stead in a department that has a wide range of sort of policy areas to cover.
Yeah, and he was nice to you. It wasn't too terrifying an experience. No,
I having worked in many Crown courts and in front of lots of people, worked alongside lots of different people, I would say my resilience levels were pretty high. I also think that other thing that being a barrister taught me was that being prepared is often the right way to get on the front foot with people. So that's a lesson that I think I've taken through. And so making sure you're not turning up without knowing what you're talking about to some extent, as much as you can be prepared, I think is something that's appreciated by people that are wanting to listen to your advice.
What do you think your most, I don't know if scary is the right word, but what's been your moment of either doing something or meeting someone that's been the most nerve-wracking, do you think?
Oh, I don't know. I mean, I've got to say, the first few times you go and see ministers, it feels different. But I was probably more terrified of going into the Court of Appeal than I was in front of ministers.
Yeah.
I think there's something. You're generally in a smaller room. It's sometimes quite one-on-one in terms of your interaction with a minister. But the scale and the level at which you're talking about is generally at policy or system level. Whereas, if you're in the Court of Appeal, it's normally about somebody who's at the heart of it. And I suppose you're 15 steps closer to feeling a real sense of responsibility about being the person that's singularly responsible for what's happening in that person's life or whatever. So again, really useful training for anybody in policy is to make sure that you have some of that frontline contact so you can hold it and remember it when you're talking figures and facts and all the rest of it. You actually have a sense of what it means to a human being.
Yeah. And then the next step was to justice. Is that right? So was that?
Well, MOJ via that. So I had a range of portfolio and policy areas in the MOJ. I worked with 6 Lord Chancellors, the same Michael Gove as the first, and there were a range of others, and lots of junior ministers. So yeah, it was again really interesting. Deeply felt great sense of responsibility throughout, particularly in COVID. And then from there into the.
So you were there during COVID, were you?
Yeah. So I was actually, one of my responsibilities was being in charge of something that was called death management, which was a pretty sobering program of work, but it was ensuring that there was sufficient capacity for those people that were dying, and ensuring that there was access to funeral services, and making sure that people had the right funding for that. Some people can't afford, and there is access to some funding available to support people. But it was on one side, incredibly sobering, and again, a deep sense of responsibility involved in it. On the other, it's my best experience of working cross-government and working with other departments. It was a real company with a real goal and shared outcome, which is why I'm a massive fan of trying to be outcome focused and to find those the outcomes that you can share with other people, because it was such a great example of where, when you are all focused on achieving the same goal, you can put aside the sort of the budgetary argument. You can put aside but we do it this way, and you can really do some amazing things.
Yeah. And I have to say, again, the civil service, I just hadn't come across during my career until I went to sit on the board of the government legal department. And I was endlessly impressed with the people that I met at all levels throughout the civil service, of their dedication, this real desire to do something good for the country, but also just their quality. They were amazing people. And I think, sometimes the civil service gets a hard time. And I think, we probably don't appreciate enough all the amazing work that goes on in the civil service supporting the government. It's incredible. Yeah.
I mean, the one thing I missed from the MOJ was the people. They are amazing. I completely agree with everything you said.
Yeah. And then was it a hard decision to leave that to go into, I guess, your first step into the not-for-profit sort of third sector world?
It wasn't a hard decision, because it was a fairly long process to get into Justice, and Justice was already, the organisation was very, very well known by the MOJ. It was one of the things that attracted me to go for the job in the first place. Mm-hmm. Its work and reputation for high quality work was known across a range of different aspects of the MOJ, HMCTS, the CPS, etc. So that drew me in. The thing I was, I suppose, wanting to test a bit was the sort of sense of how innovative, and because lots of the ideas that Justice comes up with is around pragmatism and finding practical solutions. So not just a think tank that has lots of ideas that are not achievable because they will cost billions of pounds or whatever. Mm-hmm. But actually an organisation that's finding solutions that not only will work, but are able to be delivered without huge expense, or without always having to lay down 15 pieces of legislation. It has to be things that are deliverable.
Yeah. Okay. And so before we get, because I obviously would love to talk a bit more about Justice and the work and your plans for the future. But looking back on your career, are there any moments of particular challenge that stands out? And it could be great to know if there are, and then how did you deal with them? What did you learn from them?
Yeah, there were times where I felt, so there is an occasion when I was in the CPS where I talked about going for different jobs and so on, and I didn't feel there was a fair process in place, which has definitely lived with me, and has made sure that whenever I'm part of a recruitment process or leading a recruitment process, that I remember how I felt during that time. But where I basically was told, for example, that there was no real interview, no formality, just come along for a chat, and then it turned out to be a 3-person panel, and that it very much was a competition, and I didn't end up getting the job, which the person who got it was a very good person and was entirely entitled to do it, frankly, based on what I'd seen. But I think being open and transparent about a recruitment process and then adhering to it is pretty important, and pretty, as I say, something that I've taken through.
Yeah.
There's probably lots of different things that I've done wrong and have learned from, I'm sure, over the years. But there's nothing like learning from seeing how other people do it. And I constantly observe, and I'm curious about, as I said earlier, lots of noddy questions of people, and try and ensure that I create an environment that allows other people to ask those questions as well.
Yeah, and it's not always easy to ask those questions that I think you said earlier, stupid questions, but I'm sure they weren't when you were thinking about going into law. But often we feel like we have to know the answer, and so we don't ask the stupid question. But my experience, certainly working with bankers is like, they'd be explaining a structure to me and I'd be like, I don't understand. And then think, oh, am I just being really stupid? And then I'd ask the question and then I'd realize the person who was trying to explain it to me also didn't understand. So it's amazing. And there really shouldn't ever be a stupid question, should there?
No. I think you're very right to pick me up on that. I agree. I don't think there is a stupid question. And I think there's also sort of on the opposite end of that, there's something about, and maybe there's a bit of experience in here as well, but there's ambiguity and learning to be okay with ambiguity as well, which is sort of the other, I think that was a really big learning curve for me in both HMCTS and the MOJ in particular, is that lots of times other people won't know, nobody will know the answer. So actually, your proposal may well be something that will, be runnable or doable. And other times no one will know the answer, and you kind of have to work your way using the skill sets and the expertise that are around you to come up with the conclusion. But holding ambiguity can be quite tough when it's not solved in minutes or hours, but actually months and weeks and months.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, so then you go for the role at Justice. What did you go for you weren't working there before, you went for the chief executive role and you got it. So what did that, tell me a bit about what that felt like stepping into that role, and then let's talk a bit about Justice, what it's done in the past, what its plans are for the future.
Okay, so what it felt like, it felt brilliant. I mean, I was walking into an organization that had all of the sort of assets and reputation I've already mentioned. But it also, and I think this is probably true across the NGO sector, it's very values-led. Whilst in the MOJ, I and my leadership team worked very hard to instill the values that the MOJ has into the team and putting people at the heart of what it is that we're trying to do as policymakers. Justice already had quite a lot of that nailed, so it was sort of already a mature values-led organisation. So that was wonderful. The second thing that was wonderful is that we all talk about in government trying to be evidence-led, and sometimes that's true, and sometimes the politics get in the way, and sometimes money gets in the way, whatever. But being evidence-led isn't something you can hand on heart say is what has always been happening. Not least actually because in the justice sector there is a real lack of evidence in quite a number of different areas. But in justice, we put evidence first, so that we spend a lot of time researching the areas. We speak to experts who have done their own research. We learn from that research. We synthesize the different data and evidence that we can get hold of. Where there isn't, we'll do sort of a qualitative approach, and then we're able to come up with answers to complex problems that we know are founded in that sort of in that foundational, that great sort of foundation of evidence.
Okay, excellent. And what are Justice's plans? What's on the agenda going forward? I know you've just released a strategy. So what are you looking at focusing on for the future?
So we've got 4 strategic goals for the next 6 years. So our strategy that we've just launched takes us to 2030. So in terms of our program of work, we've worked that out for the next 12 to 18 months, and we will continually review. But the things we really want to focus on for the next 6 years is firstly ensuring that the rule of law is established as a key feature of our democracy. And one of the ways in which we've done that, or are trying to do that, because it's very much, I should say, a work in progress, is create a guide for the legislators, that's the MPs, the peers in the House of Lords, to better understand how to make good law. Mm-hmm. And how to ensure that the rule of law is part of what they're thinking about when they're creating that law and when they're debating. Knowing that there are over 52% of MPs who are brand new legislators in this new parliamentary session, it felt like a really good time to do that piece of work and to roll it out, which we're in the process of now doing. In fact, we've got a launch event in the Commons next week with lots of interesting people speaking. Secondly,
I mean, before you go to rule of law, what is the rule? Tell us what is the rule of law and what's like bad law in terms of the rule of law?
I mean, the rule of law, I mean, you can boil it down to three things. I mean, there's lots to it, but basically it's around the law applying to everybody equally. So if you're a victim in Devon or you're a victim in Durham of a criminal offence, the law should, and the system and the administration of the criminal justice system should apply to you equally, for example. Secondly, no one's above the law. Maybe a good example of that is COVID, and everybody needing to adhere to the rules that were in place, or there are consequences. And thirdly, that government must comply with the law and should not exercise its power arbitrarily. So perhaps an example of that would be the Miller 2 judgment around prorogation, where
around Brexit and
judges deeming that the government had gone beyond its natural power. So those are the three sort of big principles around the rule of law. The law made, an example of the rule of law or law being made badly would be something called the Henry VIII sort of legislation. That's primary legislation where you give a sense of what you want to do, or the government will give a sense of what they want to do in the legislation, but then deem lots of it to be implemented or to be shaped more clearly by secondary legislation. Now, primary, as you might know, it has quite a lot of debating. There's a lot of process around reports and around people scrutinising that legislation, whereas secondary can often simply be signed by a minister if it's a type of secondary legislation. And sometimes there might be a bit of a debate, but it's a much less scrutinised process. So if you're putting everything into secondary, or making secondary being the documents that are telling you how the law gets applied, that's a troubling way to create law, because it means that the democratic process is to some extent being usurped. So that would be my example of bad law.
Really helpful. So I'll let you know after that brief lesson in constitutional law, which was very helpful. Carry on with the priority number 2 for justice.
So priority number 2 is a bit of our bread and butter. So we've challenged discrimination and inequality for many years now, and that very much is going to be something that we continue to focus on. At the moment, we're looking at, for example, women and girls in the criminal justice system from a racialized perspective and minority perspective. So trying to make improvements there. The third area, I can talk a bit more about that if it's of interest. But the third area, and I've mentioned this a few times, but putting people at the heart of the system and ensuring that the system is trusted and has better data to ensure that it is built around what people actually do need. So that's going to be a big focus for us. We're doing some work on AI and the law, and creating the principles that we think ought to exist in the creation and development of AI from a justice sector perspective. So watch that space. The principles hopefully coming out in the next few months.
Yeah, fascinating.
Big program of work after that as well. And then fourthly, and again, I've touched on this, is about trying to increase the public's understanding of the value of what the justice system is and its value. And within that, to try and set out and articulate some of the challenges, but also some of the solutions.
Yeah. Okay. Amazing. And do you feel like, is justice like an advisor to the government, or is it holding the government to account? Where do you sort of view yourself? Does it depend what subject you're talking about?
It depends what subject, depends where the policy or the law is, where it is in terms of its cycle. But I mean, we're the only non-governmental organisation, the only NGO whose work spans the entirety of the UK justice system. So we do interact or do engage with the Scottish government, we do engage with the Welsh government and the Northern Ireland government. And depending on whether we know that laws are being introduced. So for example, when in the Conservative manifesto, the last Conservative manifesto, there was talk of judicial review being reviewed. We set up an advisory group that was chaired by Lord Justice Gross. Equally, when rights were talked about in that same manifesto, we set up a human rights advisory group that Lord Dyson, former Supreme Court Justice, and Marcel Rolls chaired. So we try to, if there is policy being developed, we'll try and create advice and advisory groups and work to input into it. If something's happened, or law has been passed, or we can see that there are areas of policy that need improving, then it becomes more trying to persuade government to make the changes that they need to make.
Yeah. Okay. And then for anyone listening, like, how can they get involved in supporting justice or working out what justice is doing or keeping up to date? Yeah.
So please be a member would be my starting point. Membership is available to all lawyers and all non-lawyers with an interest in social justice. There's something for everybody on our membership scheme. You mentioned Justice 60. So for those who are in a position to be more generous, there is a group called our Justice 60, which anyone's interested, I'm very happy to talk to them about that. We're also in the process, and this is the first time I've mentioned this, and it will be mentioned more at our AGM in the next week or so. But we're thinking about how we can better engage with younger people, so the sort of 16 to 25-year-olds, and thinking about how we can better understand the areas of justice that they are worried about, that they would see or gain greater value from being empowered a bit more with some information. So yeah, that's going to be a newer area for us, building on what we do with law students, etc., but trying to go wider.
Yeah. Okay. Excellent. And where does the funding from Justice come from? Do you get sponsored, or do you get funding from anywhere in particular? Individual giving, obviously, some of it.
Yeah. So we have the membership takes up just over 10% of our is roughly 10% of our income. The 40% from trusts and foundations that we have to apply to, and some of those are multi-year, some are not, and there's a whole range of how much any individual grant might be. And then, as you say, the sort of bigger chunk, the 50%, is from law firms who are providing donations to individuals, and Art Justice 60 and legacy. So thinking about probate and wills is an area as well that people do think of us, which is great, and at that point in their lives. So yeah, a range of different places.
Okay. So let's just move a little bit on towards the end onto you. So a couple of closing sort of traditions are, I've started asking the amazing women that I talk to about their strengths. And that's because my experience of when I'm coaching, talking to women about their strengths, is they often are great at giving me one if I really push them two, and then they'll start telling me about a weakness. So I want to try and get people to own their strengths and talk about them. And then we'll close with your 3 pieces of advice to your younger self. But yeah, tell me about 3 of your strengths. Proudly and excitedly.
Well, you're right about that 1 or 2 thing. You gave me a little bit of notice to think about this. Yeah. So I have thought of 3. And listen, I think I have quite a high capacity, and I think that's so I'm able to take on quite a lot, and I really enjoy having a varied sort of portfolio of things to think about. Secondly, resilience. I think that's been a really big part of my career. We touched on it a bit earlier, and needing to work with a range of different people with different values has been a really big part of that. Thirdly, inclusion. I mentioned fairness at the very beginning as being as, cut me in half. I think fairness would be written somewhere in the core throughout. And I think inclusion has been it's been something I can articulate better, but probably has been something I've felt, and I think I'm good at, from everything, from being acting with humanity, and I try to act kindly and instill this sort of culture of kindness, but equally, having a diverse workforce in every meaning of the word has been a really big part of the last sort of 10 years of my career. That's only going to get bigger over the coming years.
Well done. See, that wasn't that painful. There was a think in there at the beginning. I think I have capacity. See, if I was coaching you, I'd be like, let's take that out. Let's just say I have amazing capacity. But and then finally, what would your 3 pieces of advice be to your younger self, do you think?
One is really easy, because I've said this a few times. One is that don't waste time overanalyzing, and only allow yourself to be constructively reflective. I literally 10, 20 years of my career, I think until my late 30s, did I have this sort of, I would allow myself to go through this sort of cringe-inducing playbacks of flagellating myself of how awful a particular meeting or a presentation or something in court was, and it did me no good. It did nobody, anybody else I was trying to work with or serve any good. So only constructive reflection is what I allow myself to do now. Definitely no cringing. Secondly, I would have sought out, this is just something I just didn't know about. I would have sought out coaches and mentors and sponsors. I would understand what those functions do. I'd have done that much sooner. It was accidental that I benefited from that sponsor in the CPS and to the HMCTS, and I think there's something a lot more deliberative, and maybe those in their 20s and teens are better at doing that now or know about it more, but that would be something I would have done more of. And thirdly, I think I'd have got rid of the albatrosses. We all have these earlier on. For me, it was I didn't do as well in my A-levels or my degree as I wanted or thought I was able to do, and there's some personal reasons behind that, but I allowed myself to have that hanging around me until quite recently, actually. And I think there's something about being the master or mistress of your own destiny, and as with any good architect, if you need to redesign what you're hoping to do or do them in a different order, that's okay. And life is, there's lots of opportunities there. And I've seen others and with much bigger albatrosses than I have had. And I've drawn a huge amount of inspiration from those people too.
What finally allowed you to let them go, do you think?
I think I listened to the advice of some people I trusted who said, why are you worrying about this? People who I admire and who I respect. So there was a bit of, I suppose, informal coaching that I benefited from. I think that there was also, when you have these sort of, particularly when you're applying for new jobs and you look back about what you've actually, and you have to think about those examples and you sort of think, oh my goodness, I can do some stuff. And that hasn't had the impact I thought it would have done when I was 18 and then, as I say, seeing how other people have got over more, for me, that's whenever something is not going well, I do try and draw on looking at people who are in a worse position, because for me, that personally helps me to put things into perspective a bit more. And that, seeing what other people have achieved with far greater difficulties in their backgrounds has, as I say, inspired me to do better.
Right.
And put some of that to one side.
Thank you. Well, look, thank you so much, Fiona. We'll put some links to Justice into the show notes. Do go and look at the website. Do think about signing up. It's really, really important. We're really lucky. We do have this incredible rule of law in this country. We have this incredible justice system. Of course, there are lots of things that, like everything else, that need improving, and we need people working on and being focused on what does need to be improved and how do we make sure we retain all of the great things about the system that we've got. So do have a look at the website and become a member. And Fiona, thank you so much for your time. It's been really fascinating talking to you.
Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure. Thanks, Erica.
Thank you.